Good evening, Homiletics class. Hope all of you are doing well. Thank you for tuning in tonight. Dr. Booz, thank you for taking a look, and everyone, thanks for checking in. Tonight, we're going to be talking about Jeremiah. Jeremiah is one of the prophets in the Old Testament. God used the prophets as his mouthpieces, and we're going to go right to the text. So let's get into it. Our passage tonight is going to be from Jeremiah chapter 7, verses 1 through 15. And we're reading from the NIV. This is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Stand at the gate of the Lord's house, and there proclaim this message. Hear the word of the Lord, all you people of Judah who come through these gates to worship the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Reform your ways and your actions, and I will let you live in this place. Do not trust in deceptive words and say, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. If you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the alien, the fatherless, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place, in the land I gave your forefathers forever and ever. But look, you are trusting in deceptive words that are worthless. Will you steal and murder, commit adultery and perjury, burn incense to Baal and follow other gods you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house, which bears my name, and say, we are safe? Safe to do all these detestable things? Has this house which bears my name become a den of robbers to you? But I have been watching, declares the Lord. Go now to the place in Shiloh where I first made a dwelling for my name, and see what I did to it because of the wickedness of my people Israel. While you were doing all these things, declares the Lord, I spoke to you again and again, but you did not listen. I called you, but you did not answer. Therefore, what I did to Shiloh, I will now do to the house that bears my name, the temple you trust in, the place I gave to you and your fathers. I will thrust you from my presence, just as I did all your brothers, the people of Ephraim. You might say, man, Paul, that's a lot. That's pretty heavy. Why would you start out there? We'll get to that. The title of the sermon tonight is Not in My House. We all grew up with our parents in one form or another, and if you lived with your parents long enough, you heard them say, hey, as long as you live under my roof, you're going to obey my rules. You're not going to do that while you're living here. You want to do that, you get out on your own. And some of us did go out on our own. And that's what we're talking about tonight. Who is Jeremiah talking to here? We said before that Jeremiah is one of the prophets, and he's talking to Judah. And the stage that we have for the sermon here is likely one of the three festivals that were held each year where all the men of Judah had to present themselves before the Lord. They had to come into the temple and present themselves before the Lord and to the priests. And as we get into the text, we look in verse 2 where Jeremiah says, hear the word of the Lord. Now, if you look at the word hear there, it's not just talking about hearing with your ears as we traditionally think about it. It's also talking about opening up your heart, opening up your minds, and actually hearing the words that Jeremiah is saying. Hearing, it means to get it into you. Not just in one ear and out the other, as the saying goes, but actually get it into your heart, get it into your being of who you are. Jeremiah gets right into it when he says in verse 3 and 4, reform your ways. This isn't a vague message coming from Jeremiah. It's very clear. There's nothing about this that's left open, for interpretation like some other scripture is. He starts out saying, hear the word of the Lord. This gives emphasis to what he's saying. It lets the people know that this message is coming directly from God to them and that they need to perk up and pay attention. He would have given this message at the gate, as it says in the scripture. The gate's the place that people would have come to enter into the temple, and catching them at the gate would have given him the greatest opportunity to speak to the greatest number of people. This would have put Jeremiah in danger. The priests would not have been happy that Jeremiah was there to preach this message, but as a prophet of God, he wouldn't have been afraid of that, and he knew taking that chance going in that he would really anger some people. But that's what God told him to do, and he was a good servant in doing that. So he also goes on to say, don't trust deceptive words. And he says the temple of the Lord 3 separate times. He doesn't say that because he doesn't think people will get it the first time. Basically, he's saying, we're here, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, temple of the Lord. He's almost mocking the people because they viewed being in the temple of the Lord as a place of safety. This is a place where they would have gone to where they were covered for their sins, and they basically were safe here, and that comes into play a little later as we go on into the message. In verses 5 and 6, Jeremiah goes on to list what they must do to change their ways. If you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the alien, which alien here is not alien from outer space, we're talking about alien being a person from another land, someone who is not necessarily from Jerusalem. If you deal with the alien, the fatherless, or the widow, do not shed innocent blood in this place. And if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place. So he basically gives them a list of things to do that they can live justly. Don't deal with each other right. Don't harm people that aren't from the area. And really don't shed innocent blood, and don't follow other gods. The children of Israel really had a problem, if you look back historically, at following other gods. Seeing that no matter how many times God saved them and brought them through whatever problem they were facing, they always went back to their idols. They always went back to their other gods. And this is something that has plagued the children of Israel throughout history. And God has dealt with them time and time again. And each time he saves them, it sets them up to recognize him as God and really worship him as the God for who he is. Yet somehow they always revert back. I think that's not unlike us in a lot of ways. We experience God's mercy, and still we find ourselves going back and doing the same things. I know it's happened in my life, where you get free of something, and then when the chains have been broken, you find yourself going right back to it. Sometimes that's the devil tempting you, and sometimes that's just you not guarding your heart. And I say that from experience, because when you don't guard your heart, it's easy to fall back into those temptations. But that's a talk for another day. He uses an if-then statement, saying if they change, they may stay. This also displays God's mercy. God isn't saying, hey, you've done this, so now I'm going to kill you all. He's saying, hey, you've done these things. If you do the right things, then I will allow you to stay here. And it's God using Jeremiah to give them the opportunity to basically just do the right thing. And God's not asking a lot of them here. Okay, if you look at what he's asking them not to do, don't shed innocent blood. Don't worship other gods. Deal with each other fairly and justly. Like, these are very, very simple things that God's requesting of them. It's not a complex problem they have to solve in order to find themselves in right standing with God. So as we go on and we look at verse 9, he talks about what they're doing wrong. And if you look at verse 9, it says, will you steal and murder, commit adultery and perjury, burn incense to Baal, and follow other gods you have not known? That list parallels the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are laws that were in place that they would have known. And again, this is not some foreign concept to them. And if God is using Jeremiah to list these are things they're doing. They're committing murder, they're stealing, they're committing adultery, they're lying on one another, they're burning incense to Baal, and says, Father, other gods you have not known. Known in that context means known in an intimate way, not just known on the periphery, but known intimately. And God is saying to them, listen, you don't know these other gods the way that you know me. God is in covenant with them, and they know him in a way that they don't know these other gods, and he's bringing that to their attention. Worshiping Baal is particularly offensive to God for a couple reasons. If you talk about burning incense, making sacrifices in the Old Testament, when you make sacrifices to God, that is a way to be in right standing with God. And when you take those sacrifices and you burn incense not to the one God, but to Baal and these other gods, then not only are you taking away from the God who has saved you and brought you into covenant with him, you're wasting those sacrifices, that incense, on false gods, but you're also angering the God whose wrath could actually destroy you. So it's kind of a double-edged sword there. not only are you wasting your worship, wasting your incense, wasting these things, but you're also angering the true God. In our lives, we may not be worshiping Baal. We may not be worshiping false gods. I hope you're not doing that. If you are, you should probably check the Code of Conduct for Southeastern. Perhaps look at another place to study, because I haven't read all of the policies, but I'm pretty sure they frown upon that. Maybe Dr. Booz can enlighten us later on in an email or the forums as to the penalties for worshiping false gods at Southeastern. So if you're doing that, maybe just go and check out now. We'll look at that later. But are there things in our lives today that we put in front of God? Do we put time with friends? Do we put time on the phone? You look around today, anywhere you go, and people are doing this. It's not carpal tunnel, it's cramping thumb syndrome. Do we put God behind in a place where he should not be because there are other things in front of him? We can worship, not necessarily false gods, but worship other idols that aren't gods, that take the place of God in our lives. And we've all been guilty of it at one point or another, because today life is so busy and we get so caught up in things that we need to do or things we have to do or think we have to do that God tends to take a back seat. And he's a very, very jealous God. He does not want us to put anything in front of him. And that was one of the other things here in this passage that really, I think, upset God, is he's a jealous God, and here you have his children who he's in covenant with worshiping false gods, worshiping Baal, burning incense to him. And that's just not that's not something you want to do. You don't want to anger a God who is a very jealous God already. If you think about Old Testament God wasn't really somebody that you mess with. Think about it. He opened up the earth and swallowed a group of people whole. He sent fire down from heaven. He destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah with brimstone and fire. So I'm happy and grateful that Jesus died for my sins so that Old Testament God doesn't deal with me, because Old Testament God would have struck me down a long time ago. And I think if you look at your own life, you'd find yourself in a similar predicament. If not, then good on you. But for me, I know Old Testament God and I probably would not be standing here today. But having these things in mind and knowing what Old Testament God was capable of, these people still decided to do their own thing and felt safe doing so, because they went into the temple and then would say that we are safe. If you look at verse 10, then come and stand before me in this house which bears my name, and say we are safe to do all these detestable things. And then the scripture goes on to say, has this house which bears my name become a den of robbers to you? So what is a den of robbers? I think about the Batman movies. If you watch Batman, you see that all the time the bad guy, Joker, or whoever it is, whenever they get to their hideout, it's like this cool place where they're all hanging out, feet propped up, no worries. No one's going to find them in their hideout. They're safe there, and they're good to go. And in this passage, that's what the children of Judah, the Israelites here, are doing. They're going out, they're raping, they're robbing, they're murdering, they're doing all these things, and then they come into the church and say that they are safe, because in the church they're under God's covering, and as long as his protection is there, nothing can harm them. They can't be held responsible for their sins, they can't be held responsible for their actions, and they're okay. As long as they show up in the church, they're okay. And I think that we see that today a lot in our own lives with a lot of people, but we'll talk about that in a couple minutes. So stay with me here. So the illustration of being in a den of robbers, if the church is a place where people can hide out from their sins and not be held accountable, just as someone, a robber or a thief, hides out and is able to escape justice, then what does the church become? The church should be a place of worship, a place where we bring ourselves and make ourselves available to God to worship him. If we're using it as a place to hide, we've gone seriously wrong somewhere. And then at the end of that verse, he says, "But I've been watching you." Now that's a pretty bad feeling. You think you've been getting away with it, but God's been watching you. You think about a little kid who gets his hand caught in the cookie jar, and the parents catch him and say, "What are you doing?" "Oh, nothing." "You're not doing anything." "Nope." "You weren't trying to take a cookie." "Nope." "You didn't stack this chair and those books and all that up to get into the cookie jar." "Nope." Once the kid is caught, they're so scared that their natural instinct is to lie about it, but it's that instant fear of, "Oh crap, I've been caught." And that's kind of what God is saying here. Hey, you thought that you were covered. You thought that you were safe here, but I've seen you. So as we go on, God says to them, I've been watching, declares the Lord, go to the place Shiloh where I first made a dwelling for my name and see what I did because of the wickedness of my people. While you were doing all these things, declares the Lord, I spoke again and again. You didn't listen. I called you, but you did not answer. So if we think about Shiloh, Shiloh was a place where God first set up a place of worship, his first house of worship. Shiloh was also the place where the Ark of the Covenant was housed. And that was part of the covenant between he and the Israelites. Well, they were doing very similar things, and God had enough of it. And he said, you know what? I'm going to take care of this. You're not going to listen. You're not going to do what I'm telling you to do, so I'm going to deal with it. And he sent the Philistines in, and the Philistines took over Shiloh and took the Ark of the Covenant. And then God set up his temple in Jerusalem. And here they're doing the same thing. He goes on to say, what I did in Shiloh, I'll do to the house that bears my name, the temple you trust in, the place I gave you and your fathers. I will thrust you from my presence, just as I did your brothers. So not only is God saying he will destroy the temple or allow the temple to be destroyed because it is their hiding place or a hiding from their sins, he says it will thrust them from their presence. He will sever that relationship between him and the people of Judah. This is a problem because that's their covering. That's where they think they're safe at. So Jeremiah starts off by saying, if you do these things, then you can live here. Kind of using the carrot, dangling the carrot in front of the donkey to get him to go. Hey, listen, if you'll do right, it's okay. God will forgive you, and you can continue to live here. And then the bringing Shiloh in is the stick. The carrot doesn't work for the donkey. The stick usually does. And God brings the stick by saying, if you're not going to listen, if you're not going to get in right standing, I will destroy the temple. I will destroy you. I will allow you to be destroyed, just as he had done previously. If they didn't have history, it may have been different, but they had history to look back to see exactly what God was capable of. So what's the big idea? Turn from your ways. Are we not different today than the Jews were coming to the church without the sins, thinking we're safe? Walking in the back doors on Sunday morning with alcohol on our breath from the night before, with the stamp from the club still fresh on your hand. You're out there shaking your assets trying to attract people, and then as long as you show up in church the next morning, you're okay. Is it just to appease your parents? Or is it because you want relationship? And here, ritual replaces lifestyle. The ritual of going to church replaced the lifestyle of living right with God. Don't fall into the ritual of showing up and thinking you're safe when the lifestyle of living right with God is where we need to be. Now think about the song, This Is How We Roll by Florida Georgia Line and Luke Bryan. I know none of you listen to secular music because you're all listening to church songs. But if you did, you'd hear that there's a line in there that says, we cuss on them Mondays, we pray on them Sundays. And that is a place in the church I think we've come to that people think it's okay. As long as I show up in church, I can go out and get drunk every night. I can commit adultery. I can, come to church still drunk from the night before. And that's not the purpose. That's not where we should be or where we're supposed to be. We should be living in right standing with God. We should be striving to be the best Christians that we can be, knowing that perfection is nothing we'll ever achieve. But if we're trying each day to be better than we were the day before, then we have the best chance possible to live right before God. And just as God called back then, let's cross the river from their town to our town, just as God called them back then and said, if you'll do this, I'll let you live happily. Today, if we will just follow the right path, if we will do the right thing, not even hard things, just the right things, God will allow us to live happily in the place He's called for us. Now it's different for each one, but God knows that, and He knows the call He has for your life, and He knows the path that He has placed before you. You just have to meet Him there. So in closing, I challenge you, don't be like the children of Judah. Don't be like the Israelites. Don't turn from God. Don't ignore His word and His voice. Purpose in your heart to be better today than you were yesterday, and better tomorrow than you are today. And as long as you do that, mistakes will still come. You'll still trip, you'll still fall. But when you get back up, you'll have that fervor not to do that again, and not to fall over and over, and God will meet you there. So as we go forward, I challenge you, be the best you that you can be, and be the best Christian that God has called you to be, and you will walk into everything that God has for you. Thank you for listening. Thanks for tuning in. I hope everyone does well, and happy holidays.